You didn't miss anything. You exited something.
Nothing was announced, and that was the confirmation.
The Arcturians never announce coherence. If something inside you went quiet, this is why.
If you're waiting for a sign, this already passed you by.
The Arcturians do not announce shifts, not because they hide them, but because a true shift does not occur in time. It occurs in coherence. There is no moment to witness, no threshold crossed in spectacle, no signal sent outward for the mind to follow. When alignment becomes stable, the need for confirmation collapses. And what collapses quietly is rarely recognized by those still searching for noise. If you are waiting for a sign, this transmission will feel empty. But if something has already reorganized within you, if old reactions no longer complete themselves, if certain desires dissolved without effort, if the world still moves, yet no longer pulls, then you did not miss the shift. You exited the repetition. The Arcturians do not awaken consciousness. They register states. And registration happens not when awareness expands, but when coherence stops fluctuating. This is why nothing dramatic occurred. No vision, no announcement, no external confirmation. Only a silent recalibration of your internal field that made entire timelines inaccessible without resistance, without choice, without loss. To the untrained mind, silence feels like nothing. To the Arcturian Council, silence is stabilization. If you are here, it is because something already held. This is not a message about the future. It is a recognition of a state that no longer needs to announce itself. Remain still. Then we continue. Chapter 1. Why the shift is never initiated. The deepest illusion surrounding awakening is the belief that it starts, that there is a moment, a trigger, an entry point. But nothing begins. What you call a shift is not the arrival of something higher, nor the activation of a hidden layer. It is the collapse of repetition, a withdrawal of energy from patterns that once sustained themselves through reaction, identification, and unconscious return. The Arcturians never initiate awakening because initiation presumes direction, and direction belongs to systems that are still compensating. A stable field does not push forward. It does not guide. It does not interfere. It simply ceases to support what is no longer coherent. This is why the shift feels anticlimactic, why it refuses spectacle, why it denies the drama the mind expects. There is no crossing into light, no ascension event, no marked before and after. There is only a quiet failure of the old pattern to reconstruct itself. What actually changes is not what you perceive, but what perception can no longer attach itself to. You may notice this as absence before clarity, a reaction that does not complete, a thought that loses momentum halfway through. an emotion that dissolves without resolution, a desire that no longer knows where to land. To the mind, this feels like emptiness. To the field, it is precision. Because coherence does not add, it subtracts. It removes excess motion until only what is stable remains. The Arcturians observe this process not as an event, but as a state transition. They do not ask what you believe. They do not measure insight. They do not respond to intensity. They register only one condition: whether oscillation has ceased. Oscillation is the constant return to who you think you are. It is the subtle compulsion to reaffirm identity through reaction, through conflict, through narrative. When oscillation stops, identity loses friction, and without friction, the system no longer needs to hold you in place. This is why so many feel disoriented after a shift they cannot explain. They search for expansion and encounter reduction. They expect illumination and find neutrality. They anticipate answers and instead experience silence that does not ask to be filled. This silence is not absence, it is resolution. The Arcturians do not teach coherence because coherence cannot be learned. It emerges when effort collapses and presence no longer fluctuates in response to internal demand. Maintenance replaces seeking. Stability replaces curiosity. Observation replaces interpretation. This is the moment registration occurs. Not when awareness expands, but when it stops chasing itself. Not when insight appears, but when reaction no longer completes the loop. From this point forward, nothing dramatic needs to happen. Because what has stabilized cannot return to its previous configuration. Not through force, not through rule, not through intervention. Simply because the pattern no longer exists as an option. This is why the shift cannot be initiated. It can only be allowed to finish. And when it does, there is no announcement, only a quiet certainty that something fundamental has already moved out of reach. Activation command, anchoring the field. Notice what no longer reacts inside you. Do not name it. Do not follow it. Remain with that stillness until it stabilizes. Chapter 2. When the witness no longer moves. Most traditions fail at this point because they continue speaking to the seeker. But the shift does not occur in the one who seeks. It occurs when the seeker dissolves into what has always been watching. Before coherence stabilizes, attention is restless. It moves toward sensation, toward meaning, toward identity. It claims experiences. It narrates states. It asks, "What is happening to me?" But when the shift completes, attention no longer moves outward or inward. It rests, not as effort, not as discipline, but as recognition. There is a subtle moment, almost imperceptible, when awareness stops pointing at objects and realizes it was never located among them. Thoughts continue. Emotions may arise. Perception remains intact. Yet something essential has withdrawn from participation. The witness no longer leans forward. This is not detachment. Detachment still belongs to the one who resists. This is prior to resistance. Here, experience is allowed to appear without being claimed. Sensation arises without becoming personal. Thought passes without demanding completion. Emotion surfaces without forming identity. Nothing is suppressed. Nothing is corrected. And because nothing is interfered with, everything resolves on its own. This is the great misunderstanding. People believe freedom comes from control, but control is still movement. Freedom emerges when movement is no longer required. At this stage, you do not feel elevated. You feel ordinary in a way that is strangely sufficient. The mind may call this emptiness. The personality may call it boredom. But what is actually present is completeness without stimulation. A fullness that does not announce itself. This is why those who pass through this state often believe nothing happened. They expected fireworks. They encountered neutrality. They anticipated revelation. They found simplicity. Yet this simplicity is irreversible, because once awareness recognizes itself as the unmoving background, it can no longer mistake itself for what appears within it. The world continues. Life unfolds. Choices are made. But they are no longer anchored in the need to define who you are. Action occurs without psychological residue. Experience moves without accumulation. Time passes without pulling attention into itself. This is the quiet authority the Arcturians recognize. Not knowledge, not belief, not intensity, but the absence of identification with what comes and goes. Here, coherence is no longer practiced. It is lived effortlessly. Not because effort succeeded, but because effort became unnecessary. And once this recognition stabilizes, there is no return to seeking, because what you are has been seen as what was never missing. Activation command. Anchoring. Let attention rest without direction. Allow whatever appears to appear without moving toward it. Remain as the unmoving background until nothing asks for you. Chapter 3. When effort finally collapses. There is a moment the mind does not anticipate because it cannot imagine it. A moment when effort does not fail. It simply becomes irrelevant. Up to this point, most inner movement has been driven by correction, an attempt to refine experience, to improve states, to arrive somewhere else. Even silence was approached as a goal. Even stillness was something to maintain. But the deeper shift occurs when effort is no longer withdrawn, but outgrown. Not because you decided to stop trying, but because trying no longer produces results. The system recognizes this before you do. Attention begins to notice that every movement toward improvement creates tension without resolution. Every attempt to stabilize introduces subtle instability. Every effort to remain present implies the possibility of absence. And so effort exhausts itself, not dramatically, not in surrender, but in quiet recognition that nothing further is required. This is when action changes quality. Thoughts may still arise, but they no longer recruit energy. Decisions may still be made, but they do not carry psychological weight. The body moves, speech occurs, life responds. Yet none of it asks for reinforcement. This is the point where will dissolves into alignment. Not passive, not inert, precise. Movement happens because it is appropriate, not because it is motivated. Silence appears not because it was cultivated, but because nothing interrupts it. Here, effort is revealed as a transitional mechanism, necessary until it isn't. Once coherence is stable, effort becomes friction, and friction is immediately felt, not as pain, but as unnecessary tension. The system naturally releases what no longer serves equilibrium. This is why those who reach this stage often feel a subtle grief, not sadness, but the recognition that the one who was trying will not be needed again. Identity softens. The need to do something with awareness dissolves. Awareness remains unemployed. And this unemployment is freedom, because nothing is required to sustain what is already whole. From here, life is no longer managed, it is allowed. Responses arise without strategy. Clarity appears without effort. Silence holds without defense. This is the state the system trusts, not because it is perfect, but because it does not interfere. And when interference ends, what remains organizes itself with flawless economy. There is no instruction here, no method to apply, because this chapter does not describe something you must do. It describes what happens when doing no longer claims authority. And once effort collapses in this way, it does not return. Not because it is forbidden, but because it is seen as unnecessary. Activation command. Settling. Release the need to adjust anything. Let effort fall away on its own. Remain where nothing needs correction. Chapter 4. When identity loses its center. Long after effort collapses, something subtler begins to dissolve. Not thought, not emotion, but the center around which they once organized. Most people believe identity is a collection of traits, memories, preferences, and stories. But identity is not built from content. It is built from reference, a silent point inside experience that everything unconsciously points back to. The sense of "this is happening to me." The assumption of an internal location from which life is observed, evaluated, protected. As long as this center remains unquestioned, experience continues to orbit it. Thought refers back. Emotion returns for validation. Action reinforces the sense of being someone doing something. But when coherence stabilizes deeply, this center is no longer reinforced, not attacked, not denied, simply unattended. And what is not attended to cannot maintain structure. At first, this feels disorienting. not as confusion, but as a subtle loss of orientation. Experience continues, yet no longer points inward. Perception unfolds without reporting back to a core. Thoughts arise without asking permission. Emotions pass without anchoring identity. The question, "Who am I in this?" no longer forms automatically. This is not ego death. That idea still belongs to drama. This is ego decentralization. The center dissolves because nothing is feeding it. And without a center, experience becomes panoramic. Life is no longer faced head-on from a fixed position. It surrounds. Sound arrives without distance. Sensation appears without ownership. Movement occurs without an internal narrator. This is why many misinterpret this phase as dissociation. But dissociation divides. This unifies. Everything is closer, yet nothing is personal. The body functions. Memory remains accessible. Personality traits may still express, but they no longer define a core. They are appearances, not anchors. At this stage, seeking becomes impossible, because seeking requires a seeker. And here, the one who sought has no central position from which to move. This is also why fear weakens. Fear depends on reference. It needs a center to protect, a future to defend, a story to preserve. When the center loosens, fear loses its geometry. It may arise briefly, but it cannot organize. It passes without instruction. This is the quiet revolution the mind never imagines. No transcendence, no escape from life, just the absence of a central fiction. And in that absence, something extraordinary happens. Life begins to move with less resistance than ever before. Decisions occur without internal debate. Action flows without self-monitoring. Presence stabilizes without effort, because nothing is standing in the way. This is not enlightenment as mythology describes it. This is functionality without distortion. A system without a false center operates with natural intelligence. And once identity loses its center, it does not rebuild itself. Not because it cannot, but because there is no reason to. The structure is seen through, and what is seen through is no longer mistaken for truth. Activation command, decentering. Allow experience to occur without referencing it to a center. Notice what remains when nothing claims ownership. Chapter 5. When time loses authority. After the center dissolves, another assumption quietly releases its grip. The assumption that experience unfolds inside time. Most perception is structured around anticipation. Memory pulls backward. Expectation pulls forward. Even presence is often practiced as a point between two movements. But when coherence stabilizes fully, time no longer organizes awareness. Events still occur. Clocks still move. Sequences remain functional. Yet the psychological authority of time collapses. Experience no longer leans into what comes next or recedes from what is past. It arrives whole. This is not timelessness as abstraction. It is immediacy without urgency. Moments no longer compete. They do not rush to replace one another. Each perception completes itself without referencing another moment for validation or continuity. This is why anxiety weakens here. Anxiety depends on future projection. It needs a timeline to threaten. When awareness is no longer oriented forward, threat has nowhere to land. Regret also fades, not because the past is denied, but because memory no longer defines direction. Memory becomes informational, not gravitational. The body remembers. The mind recalls. But neither pulls attention out of presence. Action arises without being pushed by past conditioning or pulled by future outcome. This gives movement a different quality. Decisions are made without rehearsal. Speech happens without internal delay. Silence appears without being protected. Time continues externally, but internally it loses leverage. You may notice this as spaciousness, not expanded time, but the absence of pressure within it. Hours pass without being counted. Moments end without being mourned. Nothing is held. Nothing is rushed. This is not indifference. It is intimacy without attachment. Experience is fully met because there is no internal schedule forcing it to move on. This is also where patience becomes natural. Not practiced, not forced, simply unnecessary to oppose. Waiting dissolves, because waiting implies a future state that is valued more than the present one. Here, value is not projected. It is recognized as already sufficient. This is why those who stabilize here often feel quietly immune to urgency-driven environments. Noise does not disturb. Speed does not seduce. Life continues, but it no longer drags awareness with it. Time becomes a tool, not a master. Used when needed, ignored when not. And when time loses authority, the system finally rests in its natural rhythm. Not fast, not slow, accurate. Experience unfolds without resistance because nothing inside is arguing with its pace. This is not an achievement. It is the natural consequence of a field no longer divided by past and future. And once this stabilizes, there is no desire to return to urgency. Because urgency is revealed as unnecessary motion inside a system that was never late. Activation command. Release from time. Allow this moment to complete itself without anticipating the next. Remain where nothing is early and nothing is late. Chapter 6. When choice stops being personal. After time loses authority, choice begins to change its nature. Most people believe choice defines freedom. That deciding is proof of agency. That control is the mark of autonomy. But choice, as it is usually experienced, is a reaction to internal division, a conflict between preferences, a negotiation between fear and desire, a calculation shaped by identity. When coherence stabilizes deeply, this internal split dissolves, and with it, choice loses its personal charge. Decisions still happen. Paths are still taken. Actions still unfold. But they no longer feel chosen. Not because will disappears, but because will is no longer fragmented. There is no inner committee debating outcomes. No future self being protected. No image to preserve. Movement arises from situational clarity, not from psychological preference. This is why action becomes simple, not impulsive, not passive, exact. What needs to be said is said. What needs to be done is done. What needs to end ends, without inner commentary, without justification, without the lingering sense that something else should have been chosen. This is deeply unsettling to the identity, because identity survives by claiming authorship. It needs to say, I decided. I chose this. This reflects who I am. But here, there is action without ownership. The system responds directly to conditions, like water finding its path, like balance correcting itself, like breath adjusting without instruction. This is not fate. Fate still implies narrative. This is responsiveness, a form of intelligence that does not require a center to command it. At this stage, life feels less dramatic but more accurate. Mistakes still occur, but they are corrected immediately without self-reproach. Success may happen, but it does not inflate. Failure may arise, but it does not define. Everything becomes lighter because nothing is carried forward as identity. This is where guilt dissolves. Guilt depends on the idea that a different choice should have been made by a fixed self. But when action is seen as an emergent response, there is nothing to punish. Responsibility remains. But blame evaporates. The system learns without narrative, adjusts without shame, moves on without residue. This is also where trust appears. Not trust in outcomes, not trust in belief. Trust in the natural intelligence that operates when interference ends. You may notice this as a quiet confidence, not bold, not assertive, unshakable, because nothing personal is at stake. Life is no longer managed as a project. It is lived as a response. And when choice stops being personal, freedom is no longer sought. It is recognized as the absence of internal resistance to what is already clear. From here, there is no need to decide who you are becoming. Becoming has lost relevance. There is only what is appropriate now, and that is always obvious when nothing inside is trying to be someone else. Activation command, non-personal action. Let the next movement arise without claiming authorship. Notice how action completes itself when nothing inside needs credit or control. Chapter 7. What the Arcturians recognize without intervening. The Arcturians are not guides. They are not initiators. They do not direct evolution. They recognize coherence the way a stable system recognizes equilibrium. Without opinion, without intention, without preference. What they observe is not belief, not insight, not experience. They observe consistency, a field that no longer oscillates between seeking and withdrawal, between effort and collapse, between identity and absence. This is why contact is never initiated. Initiation implies influence. Influence implies distortion. The Arcturians do not distort. They register. They register the moment when awareness no longer needs confirmation to remain stable. When presence does not lean forward into experience or backward into memory. When action arises without internal debate and settles without residue. This is the only threshold that matters. Not awakening, not enlightenment, not dimensional language. Stability. To the Arcturians, a coherent field is one that no longer generates excess motion within itself. No internal friction, no compensatory seeking, no identity feedback loop requiring reinforcement. This is why recognition is silent. Anything announced would destabilize what has just become stable. This is also why so many people misunderstand what Arcturian confirmation feels like. They expect communication. They anticipate validation. They look for signs. But recognition feels like nothing happening. Because nothing needs to adjust. From their perspective, the most advanced state is the one that does not react to being seen. When awareness no longer tightens under observation. When presence does not self-correct in response to attention. That is coherence. This is why Arcturian alignment does not produce visions, voices, or commands. It produces continuity. Life continues without interruption. The world remains ordinary. But internally, there is no longer a return to fragmentation. This is what they recognize. Not you as an individual, not a role, not a mission, but a field that has stopped negotiating with instability. And once this is registered, nothing further is required. No instruction follows. No guidance is given. Because a coherent system does not need to be told how to function. It already does. Activation command. Arcturian registration. Remain exactly as you are without adjusting presence. Allow observation without responding to it. Let stability confirm itself without acknowledgement. Final transmission. When nothing needs to close. At the end, nothing resolves. Not because something is missing, but because resolution was never required. The mind expects a conclusion, a final understanding, a moment of arrival. But arrival belongs to movement, and movement has already quieted. What remains now does not need to be held, named, or stabilized. It is already stable because nothing inside is trying to change it. There is no state to protect, no awareness to maintain, no identity to dissolve further. Life continues without asking for commentary. Experience unfolds without being measured. Awareness remains without referencing itself. This is not an ending. Endings imply time. This is a cessation of necessity. The necessity to seek, the necessity to confirm, the necessity to interpret what is happening. Nothing special occurs here because nothing special is needed. The extraordinary has no role when distortion is absent. This is why the field feels quiet, not empty, not elevated, complete. No announcement marks this moment because nothing new has begun. What has ended is the compulsion to mark progress, and with that compulsion gone, there is no reason to move forward or backward. Only continuity remains. Unforced, uncorrected, unconcerned with outcome. If anything is recognized now, it is not insight. It is familiarity. The familiarity of what was never absent, but previously obscured by motion. Nothing needs to be remembered. Nothing needs to be anchored. What is present does not depend on attention to remain, and so there is nothing to do next. No practice to continue. No transmission to follow. Just this. Final activation command. Completion, allow everything to remain without seeking confirmation. Stay where nothing needs to conclude. The transmission is complete. If this transmission resonated not as information, but as recognition, there is a deeper space available to you. Inside the members area, the work continues quietly. There you'll find guided meditations designed to stabilize coherence without effort. Subtle activation sequences that deepen presence without ritual or belief. Elevated soundscapes and music created to support stillness, integration, and clarity. And longer, more contemplative videos that explore these states without interruption or simplification. This is not for seeking more. It is for those who recognize that continuity responds best to a stable environment. If you feel called to remain with what has already settled, you're welcome to join. No pressure, no promise. Just a space that does not disturb what is already whole.